So, when I did my research, I relied on two research methodologies. It might be useful for you, not only to do your research, but to understand the world around you. The first is called critical ethnography. The acknowledgement that the society is inherently unequal, right? So, the subjects of your research may either be in the position of power or in the process of being caught in the politics of power. I wouldn't use the word powerless, because that goes against the sense of agency of people, right? So, I wouldn't say people in power and the powerless, that would be too much of a binary there. But people in the positions of power and people who are caught in the politics of power or negotiating that space. So, critical ethnography is a good way of trying to understand a phenomenon, trying to understand reality around you. It's good to understand a policy, etc. Yeah. The second is Anthropology of Policymaking, the second research methodology, and both these methodologies evolved and got articulated after the 70s. Yeah. Anthropology of Policymaking. So, what is Anthropology of Policymaking? Study of people, culture, policy making. So, who makes policies? A particular policy. This again, when you say who makes policies, we should not get a generalized view, because we all understand who the policy makers are. Elected representatives are policy makers. We are not talking about that right now, right? So, when you say influencers, so each kind of policy will have a different set of influencers. It's pretty obvious, right? Now, it's good on our part to understand whether there is a merging of interests when policies are made. Merging of certain interests when policies are made. It gives you a lot of insight into our usual way of generalizing. You spoke about NGOs in Bangalore, for example. NGOs obviously cannot be put in one single space, right? Now, there are very powerful NGOs. There are NGOs who are of a certain ideology, who are different from NGOs of other ideologies, right? And depending on the time period of a concerned policy, of a specific policy, you can see people get together and influence policies. Now, if you look at early 90s, there were two very specific amendments to the Constitution that happened, and also programs outside the Constitution. When I talk about the amendments in early 1990s, I talk about 73rd and the 74th Amendment very, very clearly, because it's about governance. Now, 73rd and the 74th Amendment, in the constitutional history of India, it is unfortunate that they actually came up in the 1990s. They should have come up earlier. Now, the 73rd and the 74th amendments of the Indian Constitution were aimed at decentralizing governance. Okay, taking governance and decision making closer to people. I mean, does it ring a bell? Because you spoke about commons yesterday. Who decides on commons? Right? In Kannada, we say Gomala. Gomala would be a grazing land, right? And grazing land is unique to India. It's unique to India. And there's no other country in the world which has a documented history of commons, grazing commons in villages, in rural areas, anywhere in the world. We have it here in India. Okay. So, when we talk about India, that is the pride that I look forward to, that legacy of being able to define commons. I don't want to sit here and say we had plastic surgery 3000 years ago, right? And that's not only unscientific, that's ridiculous to start our understanding of patriotism and a country's history. So this Gomala or grazing land, who decides on grazing land? It has to be the people themselves, right? Local people themselves. Today, do you have around India, what is the extent of the existence of Gomalas or grazing lands in villages? On revenue records and in practice, I wouldn't say all of them have been destroyed, but there's a very systematic change in the manner that rural commons are governed. Rural commons are governed. Same thing with urban commons. So 73rd Amendment was to decentralize governance and legalize decision making by local people through a constitutional amendment. That is why, again unique to India, you have the tiers of governance. So you have the Gram Panchayat, and the Gram Panchayat by law consists of every individual in the village. Every individual in the village. Legally. Okay, so nobody can be turned off, not being invited, not listened to. Whether they are being listened to is another question. Okay. 73rd Amendment. 74th Amendment was decentralization of governance in urban areas. Okay. And Bangalore was in fact one of the first cities to have an urban government in India. One of the first cities. Likewise, Karnataka was also one of the earlier states to define and implement the 73rd Amendment really well. I think it was the first state to have rules on the Act, the 73rd Amendment, the Panchayati Raj Act. Okay. So if you look at the 73rd and 74th Amendment, who were part of making it? That is anthropology of policymaking. Who were part of making this or advocating for 73rd and the 74th Amendment? That becomes your research understanding. And if you do anthropology of policymaking, who are these individuals, who are these organizations who got together, spoke about it? You know, the 73rd and the 74th were originally supposed to be the 66th and the 67th amendments. But, you know, they were pushed from mid-1980s because Rajiv Gandhi wanted to bring this. It was pushed from mid-1980s, and then finally it became 73rd and the 74th Amendment. Okay. So who are these forces? And today I'll also talk about certain other processes that happened in 1990s, early 1990s, which go against the 73rd and 74th Amendment. So you had 73rd, 74th, very progressive decentralization, power to people, tiers of governance, etc., on one side. And the other side, there were attempts being made to centralize governance. I'll come back to that later. Okay. So they happened at the same time. And that is also the magic of democracy. Okay, I don't want to sit here and oppose this from happening. People have the right to advocate. Even if it is the Tatas or the Reliance or the Adanis or the Ambanis, they have the right to advocate. Okay, but is there a sense of balance in the democracy? That is our concern. Right? When one takes over the other and one erases the other, then there is no democracy. Okay, I mean in basic kind of language. So the way you approach the issue will be as important as the issue itself. As a matter of fact, if you use the wrong technique, then you would be celebrating the wrong people. And again, when I say the wrong people, you might have set about doing your research with a set of objectives, but you might end up with a completely different set of objectives only because you followed an inappropriate research methodology. Okay. So, today we are going to approach urban commons very critically, both from an critical ethnographic point of view as well as from anthropology of policymaking, because very clearly we will talk about policies, schemes, programs and laws. Okay. So, it's good for us to understand who is behind them. Okay. Just to kind of sum it up, commons has a very long history. In India, we have a lot of documented history on commons, and while understanding them, like you understand other social research phenomena, there are different research methodologies. Today, we are using two kinds of research methodologies. One is critical ethnography, the other one is anthropology of policymaking. Okay, yesterday you learnt about commons, and I also heard somebody say tragedy of commons. You were introduced to the idea of commons. You already have idea of commons, and you also spoke about the theory, the tragedy of commons. Let's talk about mining. Let's talk about resources and the constitutional validity of some of these policies. Privatization of mining. Is it allowed in the Constitution? It is allowed in the Constitution, privatization. But what about the proceedings of the mining activity? How does the Constitution govern it? Now, let's come to royalty. Does that name make any sense in a democracy? What is a royalty? Have you questioned it? You know where I am getting at, right? Yeah. What is royalty? So, what is the royalty that a private company paid till very recently, till some of our laws were amended because of a lot of activism? 1 ton of good quality iron ore, 1 ton of good quality iron ore, what is the royalty that they pay? I mean, I'm talking about, till 2012, there were certain other amendments made. How much was the royalty? Any idea? There are different levels of quality. A good quality iron ore would pay a royalty of 16 rupees per ton. Okay. Now, what was the market rate for it? Because the market rate was never considered earlier, now it is. What was the market rate at that particular time, especially when China did its Olympics and this, that and the other? The market rate, the minimum market rate was 6,000 rupees per ton of good quality iron ore. So much so that Japan bought iron ore from India and dumped it in its sea for future use. Japan is a small country, so they can't go and dump it there. So it dumps it in its sea. Even it does it even today. Okay, they've got special kinds of ships which carry natural resources from Africa, from India, Southeast Asia, etc. And they'll go and dump it in the Japanese sea, and they'll excavate it later when they need it. Okay, because it's available for 6,000 rupees per ton. Tomorrow it might, in the next few years it might be 60,000 rupees, and Japan will stand to benefit. But how much are they giving to the public? 16 rupees. Okay. So, now when you talk about commons, how well are we informed about the very idea of commons? Number one, yesterday you spoke about it. Okay, how well are we informed about commons? Footpaths are commons, roads are commons. You spoke about health services, education, internet is commons, right? And how do you keep developing on it? Right? If that is on one side, the other side of course is what is actually happening in the name of commons. Is 16 rupees per ton of good quality iron ore good for the redistribution of wealth as spoken about in the Constitution of India? The Constitution of India, specific articles, that say the produce of the sale of natural resource should accrue amongst all the people of the country. Okay. Now, is it happening if it is 16 rupees? What do you think? So, how do you interlink these aspects of the governance of commons? They are fast changing, right? Now, I was talking to the ex-Lokayukta, a pretty approachable person in Karnataka, his name was Santosh Hegde. He was saying that, look, they not only pay 16 rupees, which is absolutely unfair, raw deal, if you can say that. Ballari is right in the center of the peninsula. Where the mining happened, Ballari is in the, if you look at the southern peninsula, it's right at the center. So, the Reddy brothers and the others, Reddy brothers is just iconic, they had two connections to ports, equidistance. One in the east, Visakhapatnam, one in the west, Karwar. Okay, so the mines send out their natural resource out to other countries through two mines. Visakhapatnam on the east and then this on the west, Karwar on the west. So, Santosh Hegde was saying, he was the Lokayukta, and when he was the Lokayukta, he organized at every district, the trucks pass through every district and the trains. He got his inspectors to check, and he found out that more than 97% of the iron ore that is going out of India is not even counted. So, the 16 rupees that you get is from the 3% that is counted. Okay. So, there are layers and layers of impropriety as far as commons are concerned. Not only is 16 rupees very, very less, and in fact, Janardhan Reddy was arrested because of his report, of this report. Some activists who got together complained to the Lokayukta, and the Lokayukta did a very good investigation, and they arrested this man, right? Now, not only is, the royalty paid is very less, the royalty is not paid for 97% of the coal that they take out. Okay. So, commons, my friends, in India is under severe threat. Severe threat. Okay. The next question for you, is it the same way in all other countries? The question is simple. Are commons or is commons governed in the same manner as it is governed in India in other countries? Simple question. Obviously, no. There are some countries that are worse off. There are some countries who are exponentially better than us in terms of the actual quality of policies and programs. Where do you want to be? I mean, the thing is that the objective or the objectives of such, practical theory kind of interface of such schools is for us to get into action. It's not theory, it's get into action. Norway today, if you look at the, the GDP as well as, per capita, as well as the living standards, it's number one in the world. Okay. Living standards, number one in the world, Norway. How does Norway treat its commons? Just like we have iron ore here, in this part of the country, what does Norway have in abundance? Petrol. Okay. And they hit on petrol only in the 1950s, not earlier. They did not even know they had petrol. Okay. So, how do they govern petrol? It's a very good, case study for you to understand. As soon as they, discovered petrol in their land and in their seas, they stopped privatization. They stopped privatization. in Norway, only retailing of petrol happens through private means. Actual extraction, see the act of extraction, the activity of extraction can be privatized. Okay. They will say, okay, we will give you this much money, go and draw that water from the well. Go and draw the petrol from the well. That's all. Okay, but the petrol has to come to the states. And the state will sell it and distribute that money amongst people. Yeah, they will sell it through various means and they will, okay. And after they have reached a certain level of development, they are number one in the world today. Will you be surprised if I told you that the proceeds of every day sale of petrol, 12th of November 2018, Norway sells petrol. Okay. Do you know when they will use that money? 65 years later. Okay. They will earn the money, they will invest it across the world, and that investment will be used 65 years later. Tomorrow is 13th of November, invest the money they get 65 years later. Why do they do it that way? Why? No, that's fine, but what does that talk about commons? It is intergenerational. One characteristic that you did not speak about commons is that it is intergenerational. Right? So, when I say they are exponentially better in their quality of understanding of governance of commons, is that they have thought through this really well. It's not about, take your water today, sell it, over. Right? And if it is number one in the social status, economic status in the world today, it is because of this level of participation and prudence in the way they govern their commons. There are a lot of good things, like I said, the Gram Sabha is so unique in India. But then, you also have this royalty nonsense that's happening. And today the expropriation and the extraction in India is unparalleled. Okay, and it is not just about India, it is also happening in a lot of other countries. How does that theoretically and in practice go against our constitution? That is why when I spoke about, okay, these are the characteristics of commons, what is the antithesis of commons? So go character wise, principles that govern commons, and everything, any policy, any decision that go against these principles or have opposing principles will go against commons. Right? So I don't want to sit here and say don't privatize, it's for you to think. I told you what Norway did. Okay, Statoil is completely state oil. Only retailing is private. Okay, but if you think privatization goes against the principles of commons, then you will have to oppose it. I don't want to sit here and say take this stand or take the other stand, it's left to you. Very briefly, good governance is an oxymoron. Okay. Actually, it is not an oxymoron, it's a misleading phrase. It's not an oxymoron, it's a misleading phrase. Good governance is not good government. Okay. Good governance is absolutely nothing of what you just said, especially participation. It's not there at all. They use participation, and today we will also learn how this participation, as pushed by good governance concept, can be critiqued by doctoral scholars as what is called tyranny of participation. Tyranny of participation, it's not participation. Okay. So good governance has to be understood from where it originated and what it actually meant. Otherwise, everyone from Manmohan Singh to Modi will say good governance, and we will have our own idea of what it means. They know what they are saying. Okay. Especially Manmohan Singh knew what he was saying on good governance, because it came from his school of thought. He believed in it. He believes in it. So this is very closely linked to what Margaret Thatcher said. It is usually used in an acronym, TINA. So liberal democracy, as we see today, is the best form of governance in its ability to provide socio-economic requirements and the freedoms of people compared to any other ideology, any time in history of humankind. That's his argument. Francis Fukuyama says, this is the peak of the society. Because nowhere have you seen so much social welfare, so much social security, so many kinds of freedoms of people, cultural expansion, etc. Okay? Very powerful starting point. Okay, to transform anything in the world. Okay, that is closely related to there is no other alternative. So what is the mainstream? What is the ideology which Fukuyama says is the best? The end of history. He's saying that these three things, neoliberal capitalism, not just capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, the liberal democracy and human rights go hand in hand and are interdependent. So he says that unless there is capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, there cannot be human rights. What do you say? You just spoke about tribals and you spoke about land and mining. Do you believe that human rights flourishes under neoliberal capitalism? It's left to you. This is what he says. And for a society to be liberally democratic, it has to adopt neoliberal capitalism. So now it is being projected, and so you start looking at your water policy that you did your exercise about. Where does this water policy came from? The water policy came from here. But this larger ideology that neoliberal capitalism, liberal democracy and human rights are not only compatible, they are interdependent and require each other to survive. So if you say, I am the Socialist Party of India, you will be criminalized. Because the first argument is that you will not be efficient. Number two, that under socialism there cannot be any human rights. You will violate human rights. Okay. So from the 50s onwards, the actual term good governance came on later in the 70s. But from the 50s onwards, there was, especially after the Second World War, the US started implementing this model. So Ronald Reagan and Thatcher came in the late 70s. Ronald Reagan came a little later. So 30 years of American model, they said, there's no alternative to this. Okay. So after the Second World War, any remnants of an idea which opposed this was cleansed. There were courts. Which actually brought people and said, you are a socialist, you are a criminal in the US. So if today RSS says, we don't see any role for NGOs to play, or you should have, you get WhatsApp messages, no? Pseudo-secular, seculars, prostitutes, liberals, libtards, intellects, urban Maoists. The Prime Minister used that term day before yesterday. Please don't underestimate the term. Okay. The Prime Minister of this country used the term urban Maoist in his election campaign in Chhattisgarh. Okay. So please don't think that it is some WhatsApp message that some loony person is sending you. Just like where, your socialism, your socialist belief will be used against you. So if you talk about needs of people, water is a need, as a basic need to be provided to everyone. Shared, the principles of commons, you said shared. Any principle which remotely sounds socialist in nature will be criminalized and cleansed. Okay, so none of these policies are written in the air. They are part of the larger dogma. Very clearly large part of the larger dogma. Okay. So they say that this is exactly what I said, participation. So if you have this, first of all, this is the determined path. This is the determined path. This is the way forward. That's why there's no alternative to this. And if you have this, this will strengthen democracy by encouraging participation. This is the promotion. Okay, so if you have to talk about participation today, it has to be within the, please understand, your doctoral scholars, your activists, they are pulling you back. If you say participation, they say, oh, good, participation. Now participation happens in this format of capitalism. Okay, and in this policy framework. So they'll talk about in PMYA, they will talk about participation. They'll mention word participation. Their participation is different. Is it clear? So their level of, their understanding of participation is somewhere here. It's not your ability to question and participate. It's not your participation in questioning the ideology itself. No, not that. Please understand the difference. Okay. And that's essentially why, if you have this, there's human right to water and the poor will be empowered. Is this clear? So good governance basically is this. And this you can put into any other sector. Neoliberal capitalism itself is a dogma on its own. It doesn't promote anything else beyond itself. So you have to look at the actions of who's the so-called father of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism. His name was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, right? You should understand the activities and the history of the life of Milton Friedman to know if polycentricity emerges out of neoliberal capitalism or not. Milton Friedman trained Augusto Pinochet's economists before a coup was organized. What comes to your mind when you talk about 9/11? 9/11. What comes to your mind? The attack on the Twin Tower. Depending on your own historical understanding, your own ideologies, 9/11 is when the Americans killed an elected socialist progressive president in Chile. His name was Salvador Allende. The Americans bombed his prime minister's office, president's office, killed him. So 9/11 that I think about is not Twin Towers. It's about the graphic intervention by, or violent intervention by the Americans in the administration of the South American country, which is an ideological war. They killed him. At the same time, Milton Friedman had prepared Chilean students who were brought to the University of Chicago. They were called the Chicago Boys. They are called the Chicago Boys. Okay. You can just Google Chicago Boys and you'll know them. Chicago Boys were trained in Chicago University. 9/11, they organized a coup. They killed Salvador Allende. They propped up a military dictator called Augusto Pinochet, and they sent back these economists to completely transform a socialist Chilean government into a neoliberal capitalist government. And he ruled for 17 years without any elections, and the Americans supported him directly. Okay. So, there is no polycentricity that will arise out of neoliberal capitalism at all, absolutely. It is an extremely strong, violent dogma. As a matter of fact, when you say the end of history, it takes our own historical perspective out of us. It snatches us as being historical subjects. Each one of us, our sense of agency comes from our understanding of history, and so it's a constant evolution, right? But when you promote one ideology and say that this is the best, invariably you will start criminalizing all others. Okay, so what you said today, believe me, you cannot say in front of bureaucrats without you being laughed at. Okay. And I have gone through this many times over, and it takes time for you to kind of counter their laughter. Okay. But if you say this today, they laugh at you because they are governed by this idea. Now, we'll go back to what you were saying. How do these things originate and why do they say this? So now, when you talk about scarcity of water, today, for example, can you say we are food scarce in India? There is scarcity of food in India. Can you say that? You can't. You can't say there is scarcity of food in India, right? Because the ones who get more, the ones who are deprived. You cannot say that there is scarcity. So, scarcity is again a term that is used purposefully to mean something in this context. You might mean scarcity you might understand it differently. So, to regard water as overwhelmingly conceptualized as a finite resource is a secular approach. You may have heard there is water scarcity, it's a finite resource, you will not get more water, and they might even engage you in rainwater harvesting. Rainwater harvesting per se is not bad, but rainwater harvesting is just an instrument to divert your attention from access to water. Okay. I reiterate this, rainwater harvesting is not bad, but for you to engage in rainwater harvesting without understanding equity in access. Why did Ambedkar have to take out a Mahad rally to access water from a public well? Because his community, the community that he belonged to, was being excluded, right? It's not about scarcity of water. But whenever you bring in scarcity of water, we all do that, we all get caught in this trap. Oh, there is scarcity of water. Oh, there is increased population. Okay. So, that scarcity angle is to make their argument sound secular. What is secular? It is to appeal to and get a buy-in from everyone. Hey, water is scarce, isn't it? Yes, it is scarce. Okay. So, one is that. The idea of talking about it is, and that leads to boxing in of alternative views. Okay, so when you say dissidents, it might even sound very activist, but any alternative view will be boxed in if you bring in a secular argument. So your water policy that you read has all these things: efficiency, finite resource, scarce, etc., right? And this simplification, if you read policies in India today, especially on commons, They are oversimplified. Okay. And that simplification of, like I say, historically complicated notions of access. What do I mean when I say historically complicated notions of access and equity? Historically complicated notions of access and equity or solutions for persistent social and institutional discrimination are reduced in the practices of water governance as promoting water management efficiency. Good governance is about efficiency. It came out of some of you said efficiency, right? So what do they mean when they talk about efficiency? Efficiency itself in the notion of good governance is an oversimplification of a historical nature of vested interests discriminating people based on their social and economic status from what is rightfully theirs, land, water, etc. So you box in alternate arguments, then you oversimplify an extremely complicated process in the name of efficiency, and finally you bring in the language of human rights. Right to water. Right to water, you mentioned right to water, your group mentioned right to water. Okay. Here and there, they also throw in the term rights. Here and there. And that doesn't mean anything. But just because, you bring in the language of human rights here and there, that leads to a legitimate domination of their policy making. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's an analysis. I'm ready to be proven wrong on this. Right? So policies become, or dominant policies become legitimate. Right? And these policies, that's why I said, accountability, there's no accountability as, when you make policies compared to laws. And these policies, over time, become law. And I've quoted from various examples across India. You've got the National Water Policy, Rajasthan Water Policy, Maharashtra State Water Policy, etc., chronologically listed. So first they make the policy. Okay, and the policies they make are backed up by the dogma of good governance. Okay. And then based on these policies, they actually change institutional arrangements. Okay. The law is sidelined. They make the policy, the institutional arrangements are changed. Okay. And then they have projects and programs, and for these projects, you'll have money coming from outside. And based on the projects, they change the law. Okay, and I've written all these laws and policies there. Ideally, in a democracy, and if we keep kind of sloganeering that this is the largest democracy in the world, it should happen the other way around. Right? So even before laws, there should be a set of principles. Based on these set of principles, a white paper, as we say, a white paper on water commons, white paper on land commons, etc., which talks about the current status of urban commons in Hyderabad. You start with the white paper and say, okay, this is how it should be. Okay, but if it has to be this way, should there be a change in law? So let's change the law. That's a democratic process. Okay, and then you bring everything else. Unfortunately, this is largely driven by the money that comes into projects. And the money that comes into projects are themselves very ideological. This is where the reforms come in. We'll start with the preamble of the 74th Amendment. Okay, just like we started the policy, water policy, we read one line. the preamble of the 74th Amendment, which was to decentralize urban governance, says that the amendment is to ensure there are vibrant, cities become vibrant units of self-governments. What does that mean? See, when the 74th Amendment was made, this was exactly what they were thinking. And I told you that when the 73rd and the 74th Amendments happened, there were also parallel processes of centralizing power. This is to decentralize power. There are processes to centralize power. So the decentralizing powers had this idea of, when you say vibrant units, you should also be exposed to how other cities and other villages across other countries are governed. There are wards, there are boroughs, all different kinds of arrangement within cities. London has boroughs. Bangalore has wards. Bombay, I think, has blocks. Okay. So in Bangalore city, there are 198 wards. So before the 74th Amendment, there were no wards. There was only the MLA. So you had the MP and you had the MLA. Okay, and the city had administrators. Who are these administrators? Bureaucrats. Okay. So to decentralize governance, they had what is called, so decentralized governance below the MLA level, 3 levels below the MLA. Okay. So that's when you had wards in cities. And wards are supposed to have ward committees and ward sabhas. Okay. When you say vibrant democracy, even in a city that is 1 crore in population, there are mechanisms, if there is a will, political will, for every single individual in the city to feel that he or she is part of the governance mechanism. Even in a city as big as 1 crore population, there is a possibility that everyone is part of the governance. Okay. Not that there won't be any conflicts. I am just saying that part of governance is deliberation, discussions, possibilities. Well, there are some people who might say, no, I don't want to be part of governance. No problem. Okay. That was the 74th Amendment. Can it be made possible? So if the question is, can cities be truly dynamic units or vibrant units of self-governance? What is your belief? Corporator, ward committees, ward sabhas. Or should you leave it to the commissioner? Shouldn't this change? If the whole point of this discussion is, shouldn't this change? Okay, forget your academic exercise. Forget your NGO work. Shouldn't there be a transformation? Okay. And your English speaking, doctoral, most of you are also doctoral or mostly masters, candidates here or graduates, masters graduates here. If you can't participate, who else will participate? If you cannot transform, who else will transform? That's the whole point. Right? Okay, now we'll stop at this. Now we'll talk about the parallel process. Now in 1993, just a year after 73rd and 74th, you know what happened in 91, right? This whole opening up the economy discussion. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister, P.V. Narasimha Rao as the prime minister. You know that, right? This whole liberalization thing. Our foreign reserve was very less. We went to the IMF. They asked us to open up our economy. They opened up the economy. That's a simple story. It's not as simple as that, but that's a simple story. That happened in 91. 92, 73rd and 74th happened. Amongst other people, there was also Manishankar Iyer, who was part of the 73rd, 74th. In 93, a year later, the USAID, have you heard of USAID? It's a bilateral agency. It's not just a funding organization, it's a bilateral agency of the government of the United States. All the bilateral agency funds come through the government. Is it clear? United States Association for International Development is what it's called. Right? So USAID, so what do you think of USAID? When you hear the term, when you hear the name of this organization, USAID, and it funds other countries. So USAID is an extremely ideologically driven, very powerful state bilateral agency. And it has been accused of many things, including sabotage and bringing down governments. Okay. Now, they have accused of running torture chambers in South America. Only yesterday, the American audit report very clearly says US aid money in Syria was used to fund rebels against the Syrian regime. Okay, this was a report that was released yesterday. So this is USAID for you. Okay. And they are also very ideological. So they don't, for example, USAID does not give money to any agency, any health agency, which promotes safe abortions. Why is this? Though it's largely a Protestant religion, US, their deep state is very conservative in nature. Okay. For example, they had even threatened the WHO for publishing a safe abortion manual. They don't believe in contraception, they don't believe in abortions. Okay. As a government agency. So they're very ideological. So they take and promote American ideology. Socialism, for example, we discuss socialism. If you speak the way you did and probably approached USAID for funds through the government, you will not get your money. Okay, that is how ideological they are. So they, in 1993, came to India, and even today we don't know which department they worked with. They said that we worked with the government of India. They did not say which department of the government of India. USAID in 93 started a project called FIRE, F-I-R-E. So a year later it became F-I-R-E-D with a hyphen in between. Okay. FIRE is an acronym for Financial Institutions Reforms and Expansion Project. So whose financial institutions are they talking about? They are talking about Indian financial institutions. Who are financial institutions? You spoke about local government. When local government takes money, for example, taxes, the local government also functions as a financial institution. So a financial institution does not necessarily mean a bank. Okay, so any financial unit at any level can also be termed a financial institutions. So they are talking about what? Financial institutions, which is also the local government, LG, local government, to be reformed and expanded. Okay, reformed and expanded. So local governments to be reformed and expanded. Is it clear? Now they had two main objectives, and that is why I said ideology is so powerful. Okay. Two main propositions. Just two. One is for public services in urban areas to pay for itself. So you can't put money in the name of a service, the so-called welfare state that we were discussing during lunchtime. The service that you provide has to pay for itself. This is where your point of efficiency comes in. They are talking about financial efficiency. If you looked at the water policy there, it very clearly also talks about public water utilities or water utilities becoming commercially viable. Okay, and that they become commercially viable only after they become financially self-efficient. Clear? So they came in, FIRE-D came in, USAID came in with FIRE, and they said we are going to reform your local governments, government in general at all levels. Number one, the services have to pay for themselves. Number two, bring in the private party. Okay, because it is the private entity that can be most efficient in making services pay for themselves. You can't allow for the government to do it. A year later, they added with a hyphen a D. What does a D stand for? Debt. Debt. Loan. Okay. So financial institutions, reforms and expansion through debt. So if they need to do a project, a service, with this ideology that you can't put money on your own in the name of welfare, that you actually have to ensure that it repays, that infrastructure will be a project, and that project will be paid for by the World Bank or someone else. So the city starts taking the loan. Okay. Earlier the country could take the loan. Now the city takes the loan. So Bangalore city, Patna city, they all have loans on them. Why? To implement these two services that pay for themselves as well as to bring in privatization. Municipal bonds are also part of it, and there are private debt managers including ILNFS. ILNFS, as you know, infrastructure leasing and finance, whatever, it sunk. It just sunk 2 months ago. ILNFS was a private debt manager for many cities in India. Okay, and they were given a very good rating by PwC and KPMG before it sunk. Okay. Now there's a lot of public banks that have an exposure to this. They have given loans to ILNFS. Fine. So now they came with this idea. So before USAID came, how were utilities made? How was service created? How was service created? Government spending. Where did the money come from? Taxes. Okay, it came from taxes and they spent. Please understand this. So what is the ideology of this? They are saying you take less tax. Okay, because the larger design is for you to have less direct tax. What is GST? What is GST? Goods and Services Tax. What is it? It's an indirect tax. Correct. Why was it celebrated? Like it's a second freedom. Modi ji inaugurated this at 12 o'clock in the night. GST is an indirect tax. It should not be celebrated. Okay, people who earn more should be giving more. But this ideology is for you to reduce the tax that the rich pay. Okay, so the government accrual will be less. They can't provide services. And hence you take loans for those services. And whoever uses those services should pay for it themselves along with a reasonable profit, as they call it. Clear? So it's a completely different ideology. USAID. And once they did this, they trained every senior bureaucrat in the country. They were taken abroad. We call them super bureaucrats. These are not every bureaucrat, but every senior bureaucrat. They are trained, they are taken abroad on this ideology. Okay. So new terms started being used. Should Hyderabad get the loan or Bangalore get the loan? Who decides? Credit rating companies will decide. Credit rating companies will decide. CRISIL, ILNFS and the rest. Okay. So these credit rating systems, indicators are based on, so if let's say Bangalore gets loan and Hyderabad gets less loan, it means that Bangalore is more credit worthy city. Credit worthy cities. They are called credit worthy cities. Okay. So all these new phrases started coming in this larger understanding of a transforming city. Okay. How will Hyderabad become credit worthy? How will any city become credit worthy? So if you actually do your research on the percentage of municipal budgets getting into services and administration, including salaries, they nosedive after 90s. Okay. Remove the hospital, remove the school, sell off the playground. Okay. Keep your iconic buildings as security for loans. Okay. At one time, 26 of the most iconic structures, historical structures, including heritage sites in Bangalore, were kept as security for loans that it took. Okay. So FIRD came in just when, and so the centralization of power was to decide. Okay, that happened through FIRD. And that centralization of power is in the hands of USAID, World Bank, credit rating companies, etc. While 73rd, 74th Amendment were essentially about decentralization power, and they happened parallelly. So if you ask me, in fact, Vishy asked me, why aren't these two amendments as well implemented as they deserve to be implemented? It is because there are countering forces, and these countering forces are USAID and other players. This era, this time that we live in, is called Anthropocene. The time period that we are in is called Anthropocene, C-E-N-E. Anthropo is related to humans, scene is a period. Okay. Anthropocene is a period when human activity has impacted climate change. So this era is called Anthropocene era. Okay, so what is climate change? So this Anthropocene has seen that largely because of the kind of emissions from the industrial period onwards, but hastened much in the third quarter of the 20th century, from 1960s onwards, there is a significant impact on the world, on the geosystems, as we call it. Okay. So these emissions are largely carbon dioxide, but also other more potent gases. These are all called greenhouse gases, right? Carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorochlorines, methane. So these are gases which are called greenhouse gases, which we are emitting. Why are we emitting? Where does it come from? What is the single most?
Burning of fossil fuels.
Yeah, burning of fossil fuels, but where? What kind of fossil fuel?
Energy.
Yeah. Largely energy generation, not vehicles. Have you heard of the hothouse Earth phenomenon? First published on the 8th of August of 2018, just 2 months ago. Okay. The hothouse Earth happens because they are saying, you know, the body has immunity, right? Our bodies have immunity. But why do you have immunity? Why do you have immunity? To fight diseases, right? Earth also has its own immunity. They are called feedback mechanisms. Okay, some are mechanical, some are chemical. For example, you have the glaciers, okay, and the ice caps. And the ice caps work to reflect light back. That's very physics. Reflection of light is physics. What happens if the glaciers go? It cannot reflect the light back. Right? So there are certain feedback mechanisms. There are 8 specific feedback mechanisms. And they are saying in the next 10 years, if we don't reduce our emissions, those feedback mechanisms will themselves start increasing temperature. So it is like an autoimmune disease. There are a lot of these diseases like multiple sclerosis and a lot of these diseases where the immunity of the body starts working against the body. Likewise, the feedback mechanism of the earth will start fighting the earth. So the mother earth, the protector image that we have, will become a destroyer. They say it, they use this analogy. Okay. And if that happens, the temperature rise will not be curtailed limited at 2 degrees, it will be 5 to 6 degrees. And 5 to 6 degrees will destroy the earth. Will destroy the earth. Okay. So this is where we are at right now. And so they also kind of try to explain this in another picture, which is even more telling. Okay. So this is the interglacial era, the Holocene era. Okay. Now 100,000 years. The earth is here. Okay. Now Kerala happened. We've already forgotten Kerala. So the human mind is scientifically been, explained as something that can forget things very quickly. We have this understanding of forgetting things quickly, ability to understand, forget things quickly. Now, the destruction of Kerala during the floods and the rains was not because of climate change. But the heavy rains themselves were part of climate change. Okay. We have forgotten already. They are explaining that, and you know that soon after Kerala, there were heavy floods in Nagaland, I think. Yes. Okay. So the incidence of erratic weather is happening, is closing. The time space between incidents of erratic weather is also becoming shorter. So they are saying that the world is not in a stabilized cup. It is in a very shallow cup. So it happened in Kerala, it can happen anywhere else. So it's okay. So they are saying that the next 10 years, if we don't cut down on our emissions, then the cup becomes shallower all the time and the earth can quickly slip into the hothouse earth. We should bring it back to a stabilized earth, but it can slip into the hothouse earth. And the the hothouse Earth is not prophetic. So this is not a God man standing or on television saying 2012 the world will be destroyed. No. The unpredictability of climate change is telling us that the hothouse Earth, which will make this Earth uninhabitable, might happen very soon. And the time that they have is 10 to 12 years for us to cut down on our emissions. Scientists usually don't get perturbed. They talk about their findings. But there were 16 scientists who wrote this. And one of the scientists is standing on the stage and he's saying that I am nervous. Scientists don't show their nervousness. Doctors don't show their nervousness. So there was this scientist who was actually openly saying, I'm nervous because this is what we have found. So on commons, there are 3 or 4 things that we need to know. The first is local is not local anymore. Global is not global. We always knew this. The rain, the clouds that bring rain to the southern peninsula of India is formed on top of Amazonian forests. They float all the way across the world and they come and bring rains to India. So the global was not always global, we are interconnected. But now, the conservation, in fact I work for Greenpeace and Greenpeace also does not believe in conservation. And I've been telling them, boss, you cannot say one lake saved is not enough. Because one lake saved will bring you lessons to save 10 other lakes or 100 other lakes. Yeah? By the destruction of that lake, you are contributing to climate change much more. They are saying, no, don't do all those things, just focus on emission. So they are saying, cut down on coal. I agree, we need to cut down on coal. So our commons should also be protected. Yeah, the second is the unpredictable nature of it. Even scientists are not able to find out what is happening and how the world is reacting. So that makes it even more crucial for us to strengthen our social understanding of commons, scientific understanding of commons. Because since morning we are talking more about the social understanding of commons. Sharing, caring, access, such things. But there is also science to it. Okay. And why urban commons? Mostly, not just commons, our life practices, life choices in cities also become very important. Cities just occupy 2% of the land area of the world. But they contribute to 70% of climate change. They are the cause for 70% of climate change in the world. So you have to focus in rural areas, but you have to focus more in urban areas. And it goes beyond commons. It is commons as well as our energy choices. We really cannot be sitting in AC rooms. We cannot be not concerned about where the power is generated. Okay. So we have to change our lifestyle. And there's a lot of discussion now on how your life change can also lead to an economic boom of a sort. Okay, so there are a lot of these discussions happening. I will not talk about it, but I only want to talk about the immediacy of our intervention, the urgency of what is required for us to do in terms of being able to protect ourselves from mitigate climate change, as it is called. Lot of practical ways of doing it, but the most important is to get into renewables. Okay, there's politics of renewables, which I don't have time to talk about. But if people can buy a phone for 70,000 rupees, I don't know why they can't pay the cost of 2 phones for 1.5 lakhs of solar photovoltaic cell on your roof. Okay, you can run a 1,200 square feet house, refrigeration included. Okay, So if you can afford a phone of that much, if you want a car, a BMW or, we have to push for why people cannot buy renewables on their own, not capture farmlands for centralized solar plants. Karnataka is home today to the largest solar plant in the world, 2000 megawatts. You know how much land? 13,000 acres. Just 200 kilometers north of Bangalore, it's already started. Okay, we were discussing this beautiful campus here, 1,600 acres, this beautiful campus. 13,000 acres taken for solar plants. That becomes a geostrategic interest. We don't have time to discuss that. So if there is decentralized renewables that we can generate, also change our consumption pattern, stop flying around as much as possible. A lot of such things, right? Walk to the office, bicycle to the office and things like that. We will be doing, good service to the next generation. Otherwise, your common protection or conservation is not just about future use, 3,000 years, 4,000 years. Not even about your children. In your lifetime, we are going to face catastrophe. Neoliberal capitalism is not the only economic model. Okay, these scientists who spoke about planetary change and the scientists who wrote this article are for the first time very clearly saying it is our present economic model that has to change. Okay, because very clearly it is this kind of consumption that is leading to destruction of the environment. Okay, and leading to climate change. Okay, so they're targeting the economic model. But you can very clearly also see that, for example, in December, there will be the next climate convention in Poland, in a place called Katowice, on the 3rd to 14th of December. So they've already started discussing job creations and climate change. Okay. There are corporate sector also involved in it. And let's be practical here. I mean, they are the ones who are causing this largely. We are also part of it. There's something called Telenor Dialogues, which has been initiated. Telenor is a Fijian term for commons, sharing, caring. Okay, and Telenor Dialogues is bringing people from different sectors to discuss climate change and solutions, especially job creation. So our country was, one of the people who represented our country was Mahindra. Okay, and he spoke about their organization, their company targets. So they are, putting very tight targets on how from now to 2030, which is just 12 years time, it's going to be a carbon neutral company. And they have completely spelled it out. Okay, so jobs will be created, but at the same time, they will keep. Okay. San Francisco as a city, from 1990 to now, has been able to reduce 30% of its emissions, though the GDP has grown 35% in the past 30 years, and the population has also increased in similar lines. So about 30-35% population increase, 35% GDP increase since then, actual GDP, not year on year, but 30% emissions come down. So which means that not only the total emissions have come down, the per capita, because the population has increased, the per capita emissions also have reduced. Okay, so these are alternate mechanisms that you need to push for. None of our how many of you knew what this article that I spoke about? Okay, I ask this because you are learned people. You have access to information. Okay. In India, there is increased ecological consciousness, but we are not getting into details. Our politicians are absolutely ill-informed, except for a few. Bureaucrats also. But these are difficult policy changes to be made. These difficult times also. Climate policies are very difficult to make. So let's appreciate the government. Let's work with them to ensure that they understand and get into this seriously.